It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson, and as always, with me is my co-host, Andy Grabner. Hey, Andy. Andy? Oh my gosh, something happened to Andy. I think maybe Der Kommissar got him. If anybody catches that reference, and why I would maybe reference Der Kommissar with Andy, go ahead and tweet it at pure_DT. Haven't done that in the beginning of a show. Anyway, Andy is not available with us today. He had something come up. So we have a fun show anyway. You're going to have to listen to me talk instead of Andy, which I know is going to be a real pain for everybody out there. But I have a great guest who this is not one of those way over my head topics, so it should hopefully be an awesome show anyway. I'd like to introduce my guest. We'll get right into it. Ladies and gentlemen, and people of all ages, Ben Rushlo. Hello, Ben.
Hey, Brian. Good to be with you today.
Thank you. So, Ben, for all of our listeners out there, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why we should listen to anything you have to say?
I often ask myself that question. I think a little bit about me. I'm Ben Rushlo, as you said. I am a vice president of services at Dynatrace, which basically means that I have a services organization that helps folks with what we call the digital experience management, or DEM, parts of the Dynatrace solution. So our expertise is really focused on real user, synthetic. I come out of a synthetic background, and obviously we're going to kind of advance into session replay. But I've been with Dynatrace, I have to say, through an acquisition, so I can't say I'm an original Dynatracer, but through an acquisition of a company called Keynote, I think a total of about 18 years. Wow. In that time, always in services. So working with lots of different customers, kind of seeing how internet technologies and performance management has evolved over 18 years. It's really been a fun experience because every customer is different. So that's me. I'm based in remotely in Phoenix half the year, and up north in Arizona the other half of the year when it's too darn hot to be in Phoenix. But
wait, you said up north in Arizona.
Yeah, so it's people don't really get that Arizona has like these amazing mountainous pine tree, kind of climate areas, right. Or geographic areas. So Phoenix is great from about November maybe through April at the best, and then it gets unbearably hot and crazy. And then I go up north and get out of the heat to a little cabin we have that luckily has internet and connectivity and everything we need. But it's going from the desert, and the place we have up north is about 6,500 feet, and pine trees and stuff, and it's awesome. Yeah, it's cool.
Oh, wow. I did not know. I myself did not know that, but I also, before I moved to Denver, I didn't know that Denver weather was awesome.
Yeah,
most people thought all it did is snow all year long in Denver. And that's excellent. Very far from the truth.
If nothing else, your listeners will learn about Arizona geography. There we go.
There you go. For anyone who hasn't been there. And I haven't been there yet. I've been to New Mexico, but not down to Arizona yet.
On down.
So today we're going to be talking about a lot of RUM topics, RUM, real user monitoring, right? And I just want to, do a little precursor to this, for everybody listening. This isn't specific to Dynatrace. Real user monitoring, there's a lot of tools that do real user monitoring. Of course, we would love for you to be using Dynatrace real user monitoring, because that's what funds this show, even though we have no funding for the show. But, this is all about the real users, the front end performance, right? So it's not specific to any one tool. Any basic real user monitoring tool should be able to do all this kind of stuff. So just that intro with it, just so we don't think it's, we always try to keep it tool agnostic. And that's the case for today. So with that, Ben, you gave me like a list of 10 awesome topics. I don't know how many we'll get through, but if we don't get through them all, we'll definitely have you back on for another show. But let's start with do you want to just go down them in order? Maybe we can tackle them that way, or did you have a specific one you really wanted to start with?
I think let's just tackle them in the order they're there. I didn't actually put them in any order, but that'll actually make it more interesting. See how they kind of flow.
Yeah, we'll get to one topic, and
yeah.
So the first one's bot traffic, right? Now I've seen this. I've seen this a lot, but you're the expert on this. But basically, right, for anybody who's thinking, what's a bot, right? And I don't think anybody out there is thinking that. We've had some interesting conversations. I think in the first year of the podcast about some bot traffic and things people can do for them. But yeah, these are basically programs coming in and hitting your website. Some are good, some are bad, right? But you have a whole, from my point of view, which is just strictly like the performance metrics or even sizing environments, I just think, okay, bots are something we need to know about. And you want to make sure for a performance point of view, maybe you put that data or maybe you send those to a different server. But from when you're doing this analysis point of view, you have a whole different take on bots, right? Where does that go?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is you sort of have, in my view, you kind of have, bots who are raising their hand saying, "Hey, I'm a bot," right? Which is super helpful because in that scenario, it's easy to filter them out, right? So, most tools, RUM tools and other tools, right, can look at headers, unique headers, and say, okay, this person is nicely identifying themselves as a bot. And you could actually use Dynatrace as an example. Like we have our synthetic product and we try to identify ourselves as a synthetic bot. Synthetic is a type of bot, right? And you can put screens, I had a call with a customer yesterday and we were looking at their bounce rate and, it was higher than I thought. And we were getting this out of the RUM data. And a bounce, for those who don't know, right, is a single page session. So a user comes to a single page and then leaves. And typically you don't want a lot of bounces. I mean, depending on the site, right? Because bounce means, hey, people aren't engaging, they're not staying. And they're in the travel space, and they said, well, actually, that's really normal because we have all of these bots coming in and scraping our site
prices.
for prices, right?
Yeah.
So that's one example. But I had another customer I was working with, and they heavily partner with, as most companies do, with Google around paid search and search engine optimization and things like that. And we were seeing in the RUM data all of this traffic coming from Mountain View. And as we kind of dug in further, strange, it's all from this Google ISP. And as we dug in further, it was all from a single kind of resolution mobile phone, right? And that's the second kind of type of bot I think that's actually more troubling is if they're not raising their hand identifying themselves, right? And you could put the screen scrapers in that. You could put what we found with this Google bot, which I'm still not quite clear what Google is doing. We've had some discussions with them, but it hasn't really totally illuminated what they're doing with that. And I think the list could go on where there's traffic that is perceived by the business owner or by the technology folks looking at their site in the RUM data as legitimate, that when you kind of go a few levels deeper, you start to realize this isn't legitimate. And it's not something that's, they're not raising their hand saying, hey, we're a bot, please exclude us. They're intentionally trying to maybe hide potentially and not identify themselves, therefore skewing the analytics, skewing the data, right? And it's a bit messy. And it's become such a big issue, I think, that I was presenting this data that I talked about this finding with this Google bot traffic to Google, and Akamai was on the phone. And for those who don't know, Akamai, huge CDN vendor. We do a lot of stuff with them. They're a great company, very kind of good in terms of pushing the performance envelope. And they said, actually, we're building a tool, an AI kind of intelligence tool, and they demoed it when I was on this call to look at our traffic at the edge, right? Because they have all this traffic coming to their servers, and also try to identify these bad non-identifying bots, right? And I say bad, I don't mean that they're, they're not like,
they're
trying
not
to
the
take
malicious bot attacks, right? But yeah.
Right. But I mean like non-identifying, don't have the bot name tag on. And they're also trying to build AI around how to know who those bots are and then be able to kind of either treat them differently at the edge or obviously filter them even out of their own analytics. So I just think it's an interesting topic because for me, I hadn't really realized. I kind of thought of bots as, okay, they're identifying as bots. It's great. I get it, understand it, but this whole kind of second class of unidentified, I think is interesting because then, you sort of start to think about, can I trust my data if I don't exclude those, or how do I really make sense of what my actual customers are doing versus kind of what these bots are doing. So I think it's an interesting topic that people should be aware of as they look at their analytics data. And I would imagine that has an effect on Adobe Analytics and Google Analytics, as well as RUM, analytics and CDN analytics, anything that's capturing, things that are supposed to be real users, right? So.
That two things I thought of while you were telling that. Number one is I can't believe Google's doing a bot without identifying, right? Because we always think about these malicious bots, but all the real players would identify themselves as a courtesy, and the fact that they're not, I feel it's a little bit negligent, because specifically, as you're saying, people have data that they're analyzing based on knowing that they're excluding known bots, and here comes someone like Google, or if maybe it's another big player who's trying to do something in a clandestine style, you're skewing people's data, and that's kind of not really cool. So I'll give a little ding against Google for that. But
totally agree.
What I think is interesting, you were talking about the good bots versus bad bots, right? And historically, bad bots have been the attack bots. They're bots that would generate traffic on your site, used for DDoS attacks and all this thing. And probably, almost every other bot, all the good bots identified themselves. But the definition of a good bot was one that was not attacking your site, and the definition of a bad bot was always historically one that was doing something malicious to your site. Whereas now I think we get a second definition of a bad bot, not one attacking your site, but one who's skewing your data by not identifying itself. They're not doing anything bad. Scraping for pricing, that's what you get if you're like a sales site, right? That's going to happen. Usually people identify themselves, but if they're not, it's not that malicious one. It's more of that, you're screwing up my data, bro. I hate saying bro, but it's kind of like, hey man, what's going on?
Yeah, and for some business people who, as we become more of a data driven, and I think this is good, right? As digital platforms become more data driven and are relying on this data, right? As they start to do A/B testing and multivariant testing and personalization, if you throw in, 5%, 10%. In this example I was giving, I think it was like 30% of their traffic was these Google hits, and they're behaving in a totally different way, obviously, because they're not human. That has a big effect on the data pollution, right? Or potential to pollute the data quality. And I think that it's not a minor thing then, because now you're rolling that data up and saying, oh, our A/B test of this sort didn't work right, or oh, the personalization is not yielding the results you want, or actually, we did a big release and the bounce rate didn't go down. And it's like, yeah, but if 30% of that data is bad, then you can't really get the optics on what those other changes are doing. So I think it is an interesting topic. I mean, I don't know if it's like the biggest thing that's happening that's interesting, but it's certainly one that surprised me, and is something to keep an eye on, I think, for folks out there. So
yeah, I think even bringing up the topic of RUM is usually licensed to buy visits or traffic and everything, any RUM vendor, right? And what we all do well is we exclude the identified bots. Right now, if someone's not identifying, that's screwing that up too, costing people more money. Anyway, so that's that's pretty crazy. I love that someone's Akamai's trying to do some sort of AI. Now they're trying to. Just want to stick with this topic a little bit more. You mentioned Akamai's trying to use AI to identify patterns of what might make a bot. Have you come across any patterns that people might be able to tell? I think you mentioned something about single resolution phone or something like that. Like what have you seen, at least out there, that are kind of giveaways to a non-identified bot, if you have any examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's and this is stuff that we've passed our product team, to think about. Well, maybe we could build something that's a bit better at catching these things. But it's things that, because real users are so beautifully odd and variant, right? We're all doing weird things on the site. It's really looking for consistency and patterns that are almost too consistent, right? So it's traffic from a single ISP, right, or block of IPs. That's a little bit odd. Single city that has twice as much traffic as anywhere else. Single resolution. A lot of the bot stuff we see is hitting single pages, and so the sessions are all single page sessions, which are bounce sessions. And so I think it's probably looking for patterns of uniformity that are beyond what you would expect with human behavior, which I know that's not probably super helpful. It's a big big topic.
I get what you're saying though. That's
what we're seeing basically. I think that's what Akamai is trying to identify as well. Now, my guess is if you can build an and I don't know if they're doing this, but I'm assuming they are, if you can start to build up that intelligence and then have even, some sort of person integrate or interrogate that data, but then you could kind of mark it as, okay, if we see this again, right, this is likely a bot. You could build up hopefully, some database kind of views where it's like, okay, we've already looked at this. We know it's a bot. Mm-hmm. Next time, it comes up, we'll throw it away. Right. And I think if you can do that, I don't think these folks are trying to be like, I don't think they're hiding. They're not really aggressively hiding, right? Like I wouldn't expect all of a sudden Google's going to say, "Oh, you found us, and now we're going to start spinning up bots from another location and trying to use a different ISP." I don't think that would happen, right? So I think these are kind of like you said, in between that good and bad. They're not really malicious. They're just not identified. If we can start to identify them with data, then I think you could start to exclude them pretty easily, probably.
Right. Interesting. Never thought of, and whenever we talk about bots, I think about them and then I forget about them, which is as it should be, but it's always really fascinating. So if you're done with that one, I guess let's go tackle number 2 then, right? So what are you trying to say with the second point here? I'd try to paraphrase, but I'm not sure if I'm going to completely get it. So you're trying to say without RUM, right? And again, this is not being salesy, but without RUM, you're missing what's really happening. But without RUM, and are you kind of saying that in terms of if you're just using an analytics tool that's capturing data, or if you're not capturing anything?
So I think the way I see RUM, because I come obviously from a performance background, not a user behavior background, and I think what we've seen, and I'd love to get your perspective on this, and feel free to disagree with me because people do all the time. But it's like these technologists and performance people have relied on kind of non-user behavior analytics tools, and that would be Synthetic is a perfect example, Chrome DevTools traces, web page test, et cetera, right? And they're looking, at APM tools and whether those are kind of Gen 1 or Gen 2, whatever, they had all this data, right, around performance, but they were missing like the user behavior impact, right? So, okay, we improved the page, but did that actually affect how many people engage with that page or bounced or we're making assumptions about the pages that actually matter. And that's where I think I'm getting to in this point too, is that, we work with customers and their technology teams, and if they don't have RUM, they're unlikely to get direct access to the pure user behavior data coming out of, and really for most customers it's coming out of 2 places, right? Adobe or Google Analytics. I mean, pretty much. They're very unlikely to get access. I don't know if you found that as well, but I mean, our customers cannot, even if they're high-level technology leaders, struggle to get from marketing those analytics pieces, right? And if you don't have those analytics pieces and you don't have RUM, then you're kind of in the dark and you're sort of saying, okay, well, I think these pages are the most important. And obviously people are pretty smart about, hey, if I have a retail site, okay, checkout, cart, et cetera, it's most important. Mm-hmm. But you'd be surprised where your kind of the gaps are. And the example I was thinking of when I wrote down this not very well phrased bullet was, we have a very large auto customer who, of course they're measuring what they think are their key entry pages, right? The homepage and, et cetera, right? But at the same time, during a month, the marketing team is doing huge campaigns, and those campaigns can be offline, right? So they can be on TV or they can be in print or obviously they can be online as well. And, what we found when looking at the RUM data over the month was, oh, wow, actually your top entry page was this campaign landing page. And the technical team really didn't know that was happening. Now you could say, okay, that's a dysfunction in an organization, but I find most performance issues are dysfunctions in organizations.
That's a fair point.
And but by having the RUM data, even though that data probably is very similar in some fashion to the analytics data that was coming out of Adobe at this customer, the technical teams were now able to have visibility, right, into how user behavior and kind of the technical pieces interplayed. And so they were able to say, oh, okay, all of a sudden we see this big spike in traffic for overall, but also on this particular page. And by the way, we're not really measuring that page to make sure it's up with Synthetic, or we're not really looking at it from a performance optimization perspective. And by having the RUM data, I can see that and now actually be a bit more aligned as a business. So I think that's what I guess has always surprised me. As soon as you turn on RUM, pretty much with every customer we've done that with, they find things they didn't expect. Like, oh, we're getting a lot of traffic from, bots like we just talked about. Oh, we're getting a lot of, traffic from these marketing campaigns that we maybe weren't fully aligned with marketing around. Oh, we're getting traffic outside of the country that we thought most of our traffic was all in the US. And strangely, we have a ton of traffic from India, right? I mean, I think those are the sorts of things, and you could go on and on, right? Top browser, JavaScript errors, et cetera. But if you don't have RUM, you're kind of missing the full picture. And even if that data exists in another silo in the organization, like in Adobe or Google Analytics, you're still kind of a bit blind, I think, as a technical person or a performance team. And so I think that's kind of what I was getting at, I guess, with that point, probably.
That's interesting because, obviously, you said it yourself, it seems to be more of an internal dysfunction if somebody has Adobe or Google and the teams are not getting access to it. But I think I do agree with you definitely in a large point because when you're talking about looking at data from separate tools, that starts becoming a little more difficult to piece together. Right. So if you even, let's say every organization did give every team member who needed it access to the analytics data, right? So they're seeing performance issues and they can go cross-check to the backside. One thing we do see over and over, and I'm sure, customers and anyone else listening to this podcast who has multiple tools, is every time you're crossing from one tool to a second tool, there's a chasm you're hopping over where there's a complete disconnect between the data. That some of it's easy, some of it's easy enough to piece together. If there's a promotion page, all right, you can look at the promotion page on the back end, then you can look up statistics on the back end. But you start going more into the correlation as opposed to causation realm. So yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree having it all in a single type of tool definitely makes it a heck of a lot easier, a lot more convenient, and probably gets used a lot more then. But I do want to put you on the spot, right? We have vendors like ourselves who make RUM tools. And then we have vendors like Google and Adobe that make analytics tools. And one of the questions that kind of pops in my head a lot is if you have your RUM tool set up very well, everyone has access to it, you're connecting that to your performance data, do you still need an analytics tool?
Yeah, it's a good question that we get asked a lot, right? Because I think a lot of times when we're talking about RUM, particularly when we have business people in the room and we're trying to kind of get them maybe to do a POC or trial proof of concept, their question is, their first kind of pushback might be, well, we already have Adobe, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that case, what I try to do, and I think this is totally accurate, is say that what we're doing with RUM and as a company is really performance first, and what Adobe and Google are doing is really behavior first, and that those use cases are actually somewhat overlapping, but they're kind of more adjacent than they are completely kind of overlapped, right? Mm-hmm. And an example of that is, a lot of the stuff with Adobe is, well, first of all, Adobe is an interesting one, right? Because going from where they were with Omniture, which was very much just analytics, to now most of our customers are using kind of their full suite. And that includes things like they have a dynamic tag manager, they have a personalization, kind of what they call audience manager. So they're kind of personalizing and content. So for that, it's almost an easier thing to cut, is like, well, if you're really bought into the full Adobe suite, right, then, and they have a content management system, then it's really not competitive or overlapping at all, right? Right. Yeah, they have an analytics piece, and what we found is people struggle to get some data out of that at sometimes. We've been told many times that our data kind of is easier to consume, but it's you've bought into the Adobe ecosystem, and therefore we would really position RUM as performance with an understanding of behavior, because that's where those intersections make sense, but we're a performance tool first, right? Now, for other customers, they actually have replaced their, Google Analytics. I think that's where we see it more probably, because that's less of maybe a major ecosystem, though Google does have tag managers and a bunch of other things. Because, they're able to say, well, okay, for us, this analytics data coming out of the Dynatrace tool or RUM, is actually, good enough, plenty enough. And plus we get the performance stuff and the integration of the larger kind of, ecosystem of our tools. So we have seen that, but I think I still see that we're adjacent, not directly competitive yet. And I'm speaking now of the Dynatrace tool, I guess, versus other RUM tools, because we're so grounded and centered in performance. And these other tools are really grounded and centered in behavior. If I look and had a crystal ball and predict 3-4 years in the future, do I think, I could be telling customers, maybe it's not even 3 or 4 years, maybe it's 1 or 2 years, hey, you don't need this other stuff? Yeah, maybe. Because I think we're getting smarter and better about adding, funnel analysis and conversion analysis, and we're going to have the ability to do A/B testing and and those are the things I think the business really buys those tools for. And so as RUM evolves, and I guess whether it's our RUM or other RUM, as it evolves more into that business area, I do think you could make the case for not having it. What I think is actually happening, which is pretty funny, is I'll look at sites and they have Adobe, and some of them have Adobe and Google Analytics, and they have a RUM tag from Akamai, which they bought. Obviously, they bought Impulse, and they have our RUM tag, right? And you kind of say like, what, what? But the reality is like each of those are serving different use cases and different internal constituencies, I guess. And so I'd love to see a view where it's more consolidation, but the reality is I'm almost seeing the opposite, right? Is like people are using, more and more analytics, which also means I think good analytics is really important because if there's a plethora of data, which one do you trust, right? Which one do you actually use for these different use cases?
Right. And a lot of it comes down to understanding how the tools are collecting the data and looking at the data. Yep. I think this segues then perfectly into number 10, since we're talking about comparison of different things. Let's jump into the I liked how you put it, the fallacy of synthetic versus real user, right? So if we're talking about real user versus analytics, and there's some use cases for both, obviously. Let's talk about synthetic versus real user, right? So for synthetic out there, just a brief explanation for people who might not have come across it. That's when you're having basically some of these good robots, as we talked about before, driving traffic against your browser. It might be a single page hit, or it could be a click path through, but it's going through and from specific points, geographical locations, think about them as like a control test. Any kind of time you're doing a laboratory test, you always have a control. So this is always from a very specific point in time, point in geographic region, broadband, whatever. You're hitting that constantly, or not constantly, but at a timed interval, as opposed to your real users, which are all that various wonderful goodies that your real users give you. And I guess as you're mentioning here, and people ask all the time, if I have real user monitoring, Ben, what do I need synthetics for anymore?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we've kind of deal with. And for a time when I worked at Keynote, we only had a synthetic tool, and other folks were developing RUM tools, and it was sort of like you felt like at the time everyone's going to throw away synthetic, right? Mm-hmm. Because all you need is RUM, and I come from that background, so I have some bias, but I've really been sold on kind of the beauty and amazing, pieces of RUM, in the ability to see kind of every user, every browser, every page, every geo, right? Like that visibility is like going from kind of black and white to 4K if what you were using synthetic for was to understand performance. And I think that's the biggest shift, right? So it used to be that we would say, hey, synthetic is a proxy for your user's experience, right? And people can read a lot into user experience in that phrase, right? And for some people, if that meant, well, synthetic is a proxy for how my customers are performing, I think that is where RUM really has taken over, right? Because synthetic is one browser, as you said, or even if you have multi-browsers, though most vendors are going to single browser, a subset of geographic locations, a subset of pages, even though those pages are really critical. The reality is you can't really measure the crazy performance that we all bring to the table with our different setups, different browsers, viruses, my grandparents' computer, my kid's computer, Wi-Fi, mobile. And so I think, what's really happened is Rum is the voice of truth for performance in production, but synthetic still has a very strong, and I think will continue to have a very strong and compelling use case around availability testing, making sure that kind of I can get in from the outside, testing everything from the browser through my network, DNS, my routing, et cetera. I think it has a very strong use case around that. That's probably the strongest. I think it has a super strong use case around QA or pre-deployment testing, because Rum really can't fit in that. If you don't have real customers hitting a QA or pre-launch site, you really can't do performance testing, of that, or you can't get an understanding of performance. I think it has a really strong use case around comparing yourself to your competitors, because I not to take a segue, but I will. I think that's a big challenge we see with customers is they collect performance data, but they have no idea if it's good or bad. I've had high level executives tell me, "Oh, it's fine that our pages take 8 seconds to visual complete," and you're like, "Well, why? Why do you think that?" "Oh, I just think that that's fine. I think that's good." And it's like, well, wouldn't it be better to make a decision based on actual data, right? So if you're in the bottom percentile of the internet at 8 seconds, that might drive you to make a different decision than if you're in the top percentile, right? And so having competitive context of what is good, what is bad, right? Whether it's in your industry or it's across the internet, because you could make the case that maybe you shouldn't only compare to your industry, because users aren't just thinking about that when they think about your site performance. But having that competitive context, super, super helpful. And it's hard to get with like a Rum tool or an APM tool. You can't really say, "Oh, I'm going to deploy, my Rum on my competitors." It doesn't really work that way. So, so synthetic has a really strong use case for competitive baselining as well. Again, I think the strongest is really for availability monitoring. I had a customer this week, again, not making this stuff up, where they run a booking engine, airline booking engine, and they were not able to capture these issues that they were seeing with Rum and a backend APM tool, but they were with synthetic. Now, obviously with Rum, they were able to cross correlate, and you could see like sessions were dropping and conversion was dropping. So it's not like Rum has no availability, play. But as a primary frontline, it doesn't have the visibility into, hey, my pages are returning 500 errors, or I'm not able to get through my border router, or I'm having DNS failures. Like, you can't pick that up very easily with Rum, and so I think synthetic is still really strong there. Last thing I'll say about that is, what I've told customers, and I think this is true, is if you were spending, 100% of your dollar on synthetic, right? And this is just talking about synthetic and Rum, not the other APM components. But, obviously I think you're probably going to start evolving that, where maybe 30% of your dollar is going to be on synthetic, and 70% is going to be on Rum, and maybe that's where you'll be in a year or 2 years, and between now and then you're going to kind of move in that direction. I think that is true. I think we're going to see customers spend less in synthetic, pick the very key entry points, the very key transactions, for availability, maybe for, pre-launch, maybe for intermittent competitive benchmarking. But I think that's sort of where we're seeing the industry evolve to.
Very interesting. Another thought I was having too with it is when we're talking about, the one use case I really love is the control, right? Because I'm a fan of science, and controls are very important. And this works on two levels, right? Because you have synthetic that's testing your front end, but you can also use synthetics to test your back end components, right? You got any API endpoints and everything that you're running. So take these two scenarios, right? Scenario one is if you have a, when you're testing on your front end, as we said, when you have all these various end users with all their malwares or anything else going on, maybe they're, we've seen in the past where people's browsers were really slow, and you take a look at what's going on, they're downloading tons of ads, and the customer's like, "We don't put that many ads on our site." Well, their browser had been hijacked, right? So like you start seeing all these kind of things. So when you start seeing some bizarre behavior slowly creeping in from your users, if you have 1 million users on your site in an hour, right? And 3 or 4 of those, or just like a small number of those users, are starting to show some anomaly, right? You may or may not write it off as, okay, some people have these, this is the end user, right? There's going to be some people who have something screwed up. Whereas again, with that control of the synthetic, your synthetic should only fail if there's a failure, because you're not adding anything to the browser. You're not changing anything with it. It's coming from the same point all the time. It's that control factor. So a single failure on synthetic, I believe, but you're obviously the more synthetic person, is so much more of an indicator than smaller it's much more of a stronger warning than a small amount of errors coming from real users, because there's so many things that could be impacting, so many outside factors. Now, taking that to the back-end side, if you have a back-end payment system and, maybe it's really early in the morning or overnight and not too many people are on your site, if you're, doing more of a geographically based store, one or two users, again, failing on something payment, you might be like, all right, something happened there. But if your synthetic is failing once, second time even, that's pretty big indicator you have a major, major problem. So that's one of the reasons why I love it still too, because you have, because of that variation that you have in your real users, because there can be so many other factors that can be leading to a user's failure or a user's error, real user's error. Those synthetics typically should be much more of a louder warning bell, at least to me. But
I think I totally agree. I think the controlled laboratory environment allows you to detect very small changes, even hundreds of milliseconds of changes, which in real user, it's sort of an interesting paradox. And I'm sure if I was a better statistical wizard, I would understand it more. But it's, on one hand, like you said, real users are all over the map, right, in terms of their, setups and kind of performance and issues. And on the other hand, if you get a site that has lots of traffic, that sample kind of gets washed and you really can't detect major changes, right? And then during the evening hours when real user traffic typically, unless you're running a 24/7, site, drops, you almost always get a performance increase. And that's really based on the sample, right? So it's based on the less sample. So it is hard if you're trying to say, okay, I want to really detect, micro kind of changes as I'm tweaking my front end, let's say, or my back end. Or to your point, I want to really understand errors, and you're right. I think a synthetic error has a lot more weight because you kind of have a controlled environment. It is harder to do that with RUM. And I think that's what people, to be honest, I think this is going to sound bad, but having worked with customers for so long, I think one of the things that was pushed people so hard to RUM against synthetic was synthetic's hard, right? The scripts can break, the sites change, you can get false positives, right? And then people threw RUM on their site and they're like, oh, everything's green all the time. It's like, it's all just, everything's green on my dashboard. Now, I think that is, it's a fallacy again of like, I just don't want to deal with the messiness of synthetic. So I'm just going to use RUM and then probably not look at the right metrics, or maybe just kind of not really realize that there's some gaps that RUM can't cover. But I'm just going to be happy because things are green, right? And so I think that's, the other piece is synthetic requires a bit of an art and a science to get right, and to make sure the scripts are hardened, and to make sure you're not over measuring or you're not under measuring, to deal with site changes and stock and inventory, and all that stuff is hard. And so I think, we help customers do that, but some customers kind of give up and say, well, as much as I like it, it's too messy. And, I'd rather just have this RUM data, which I don't really have to do anything except for put a tag on the site or auto inject or whatever. And I think that's kind of lazy. No offense to our customers out there, but I think you have to kind of work harder. And that's, of course you also need an APM piece, and that's where bringing it all together and as much telemetry as you can get, right, I think is helpful in really understanding what's happening on the site. So. Right.
This you mentioned something in there that kind of makes me want to go to point number 7. Right? We're talking about metrics and what data to look at, and I think we've seen over the years many attempts at people trying to define what you labeled as the perfect performance metric. I know ourselves, we like to talk about this with the visually complete speed index. These are the new ones that you use, and I think a lot of these new metrics are really awesome and amazing. But I think the point that you're trying to make here is that the perfect performance metric is, I would probably wager to guess that it's the one that you need for the specific thing that you're monitoring.
Yeah, I love this topic because it's one that I get to kind of go head to head with our customers about, and it's always fun, and you really get to learn a lot about a customer's culture and organization when you have these discussions, because I've literally been in conversations where it's like, well, the reason we use DOM Interactive is because our CTO came from insert Silicon Valley, company name, and they use that, right? And that's why we use this. Or our business people, they want one metric, and they really can't deal with kind of uncertainty or the ambiguity of multi-metrics. So that's why we chose XYZ metric, right? And I think it just illustrates. Again, it kind of to my point about, people want easy and the green, the green dashboard,
right.
And, something they feel like they can, take out the complexity, and which is kind of ironic, because if you think about how the internet has evolved, and I'm old enough, and I think you're old enough too, to have been around for most of that, right? It's like, how complex are these sites and apps now, right? In terms of the underlying technology, the cloud technology, the CDN technology, the integrations. And yet we're striving for, like, we think like somehow one metric is going to make sense of all that, right? And it didn't work 10 years ago, and it doesn't work now. So anytime I go into a customer and they have either a pet metric where they feel like, and I would say some of the DOM ones are pets metrics, like that don't always totally make sense to me, like, oh, DOM interactive, and it's like, yeah, but that's very early in the W3C kind of timing cycle.
Or time to first paint that everyone talks about now.
Right. Or they just have a single metric. I think we're working with a large auto manufacturer in Europe, and they chose Visually Complete. And that's smart, right? I mean, in the sense that I think the thing I like about Visually Complete and Speed Index is it's getting us closer to something any human, and I would say, like, passes my wife test, right? any human.
No disrespect to your wife there, of course.
Exactly. Any non-technical human, right, could understand. I think that's been the problem when we had metrics like, which we were a big proponent of load event end, and I still am, actually. I think it's a good measure, because probably most of the page functionality in JavaScript has fired. Probably the page is visually ready. And that was way better than end to end, which used to be kind of the old metric back in the day, because that started to include lazy loaded stuff and third-party tags. And of course, that's kind of nonsensical. But even load event end, it's like, try to explain that to a business person. Like, oh, well, it's this, timing, and it's the browser is really, loaded all the content in the DOM. And then it's like, I'm sure Andy or you could probably do a much better job of explaining it than even I could. But for a non-technical business person who is trying to use these metrics to either hold their technical teams accountable, or to drive improvement, or to understand user, experience, the closer we can get to something that makes sense, right, for a non-technical person like Visually Complete, the better. The challenge, long-winded way of saying, okay, this customer in auto manufacturer in Europe using this, the challenge is it doesn't work on every page, right? And so it's like, it's not perfect. There's situations because of, embedded frames, because of a shadow DOM, because of XYZ, where Visually Complete isn't, the end all be all metric. A chat box can come in late, and that could skew Visually Complete, for multiple seconds. And then you're going to the business saying, well, hey, your page takes 8 seconds to Visual Complete. And they're like, well, I just tested it on my browser. There's no way in hell it's taking 8 seconds. Like, okay, well, that's because that's not the right metric. So I think what we try to do with our customers, a lot of it's just education, is let's use a combination of metrics that actually helps us get to what pages need to be optimized, right? What's outside of normal. And for us right now, the three kind of key ones are Visually Complete, which I think is still a great primary metric, easy to understand, above the fold render. Speed Index, which is kind of a way of saying, how fast am I getting to Visually Complete with most of my page? And I think that's kind of encompasses the what used to be, first paint, things like that. Really it's a measure of kind of perception and how quickly am I getting some content to the customer. Right. And then I still think load event end is useful, because it does exclude, typically, if you build your pages right, it excludes third-party content and lazy loaded content and things like that. But it does give me another kind of view. And so the three of those together are really useful. Now, 2 years ago, I would have said something different, because Visually Complete wasn't big of a focus. And I'm sure in 4 years, I'll be talking about, it's Google's talking about first meaningful paint and first meaningful interaction, and it'll probably evolve again. And the point is that don't get obsessed with a metric, for the sake of a metric. Get obsessed with the idea of using, as you said, the best metric for the right situation, for the particular situation, in a way that will help you drive improvement, right? If the metrics you're using are to help you get a bonus or to show your boss that everything's okay, then I would say that, don't use it. I mean, that's just crazy, right? But a lot of
DNS
customers
lookup.
Yeah, exactly.
Look
right.
how fast it is.
Or just make them up. We will have internal discussions, when we're, we have lots of great customers, but we have some that are challenging, of course. And, you kind of sit around and have a beer and you're like, you know what? I think this customer would be more happy if I just gave them an Excel sheet where I just made up the numbers, right? Like, I just think, just give them what they want, which is I want green, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, they don't need to pay for all this complex measurement and telemetry and data and RUM data and synthetic data. They just want to see that, things are fine. They want to live in a fantasy world. And, I think obviously that's not the norm, but I think you can kind of see that when you get to customers who are like, well, this is the metric and it's because it's the fastest metric and it's, the business likes this. And it's like, okay, but the whole point of performance management is really to drive improvement for your customer, right? And so find a metric that actually represents as closely as we can, or a set of metrics, the customer, and then use that to drive improvement. So you can see I get very excited about that topic.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great topic, and what I think it really comes down to is, right, there are some better, there's definitely better metrics than others, right? But
sure.
What I think it comes down to for an organization is, number one, you need to really kind of split your pages out into things for different types of performance, right? Performance of a page load, you're going to probably want to measure differently than an XHR call.
Totally.
Even something with a login, which has a redirect and all, right? There's a lot of different kind of things that go on in these. And to me, what it really comes down to is capture multiple metrics on all these pages, because you're not going to figure it out right away. But over time, as you're looking at these different metrics and you're making improvements to some of these metrics, it doesn't matter. The goal is not to make improvements to the metrics. I don't really care if my speed index increases if my end user satisfaction is not better, right? This is tying it back to the RUM data, tying it back, and you've talked about, tying business and performance data way back when I was doing something with one of our integrations. I don't know if I made this up, but I liked the term, the performance of business, right? You got to look at the performance of your business, and if you do make an impact, if one of those metrics drastically gets better or drastically gets worse, does that have an impact to your conversions, to your bounce rate, to your user satisfaction, or any of those things? If it doesn't have an impact, you can probably start scratching it off the list of an important metric to measure. But if you do see that change have an impact, then suddenly this is one of the most important metrics to do on it. So as you say, there's no easy button. If you really want to be serious about your RUM performance, it's not just about the metrics, but it's what the change in those metrics and how that impacts the end user. And that's what RUM is all about, is, real user monitoring. So I think it's definitely, people want it to be easy. And if you get the data right, you can make it easy. You have data streams out. Maybe you can even use AI for some of this. I wonder where that idea comes from. But there's data. Turn it into information and work with this, because most people just want to have the checkbox to say we're collecting the data. But how are you using that data? And you can talk about metrics till your face turns blue, but you still have to know how they're impacting, that your end user, to see whether or not they're useful and what you can do with that data. Anyway,
totally. No, I totally agree. Can I hire you to work on our team? That's exactly the kind of stuff that we have to educate. That's so much of what consulting or services really is educating customers so that they can kind of transform their own organizations, right? And get over their kind of issues and silos and hangups around whatever it might be. In this case, we're talking about metrics and data, but that's exactly right. And I think you said it very clearly. It's like you have to tie it back to the business. And for so long, I think that's really what's been missing in the performance space. Now, obviously, you hear these things about, Google did this study 5 years ago where they slowed down, intentionally slowed down some percentage of their traffic, and they looked at how users engage with search. And okay, that's great. That's Google. That's awesome. That adds a lot of value to the industry. But generally, if you talk to most large companies that weren't in Silicon Valley, they didn't have any understanding of how performance was really, transforming or affecting the business. And I think to your point, being able to see in a single kind of view, conversion, bounce, engagement, right? I think all that's super critical, because that's really what matters at the end of the day, not a number. And yeah, I totally agree. I think it's right on.
One of my favorite examples is the idea of the clicking on place order, right? People think, oh, we have to speed up our pages specifically because speed translates into more conversions. And usually place order takes a little bit longer than other things on their site. So quite often people will look at, oh, place order is running slow. Let's improve the speed of that. But what we've seen is a lot of times once you get to someone clicking on place order,
they're already caught, man. They're already into it, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
they're placing their order. It's the pages that lead up to it, which are more important. Granted, you don't want your place order sitting there taking 15 seconds and they're thinking like, what the heck's up with this, right? But but that's also, again, tying back to what is the performance of my business. I'll use that little phrase again to know which ones are actually having the impact on those conversions. So not just making improvements, but being able to measure that improvement. That's kind of like the shift left, shift right that Andy always talks about, looking at not only, how do we take metrics from the left and push it to the right, but how do we also take metrics from production and let that influence what we concentrate on pre-production to make things better.
So, I think the thing that I like about what you just said is it's the performance metrics and business metrics in context, right? So like the context in there is someone's already 6 clicks into a conversion funnel, they're hitting place order. Like, does it matter that it takes a second versus, half a second, right, to come back? Maybe not, because we understand the context of where the user is within their kind of digital funnel or journey, right? And I think that's what we need to bring more to, and we're trying to do in our area, to the metrics, right? So another example of that that kind of drives me nuts is, people are like, well, do you guys have, data in your tool that shows, very, very cleanly the relationship between performance and bounce? And I'm like, yeah, we actually do. We have one graph, but I know who they're thinking of, other competitors. And what I say to them is, like, that's not a simple, and anyone who can tell you it's a simple equation, like, doesn't understand the context, right? That, you're not always going to find this relationship. You need to know things about refers. You need to know kind of where the traffic's coming from. You need to know where they are in a funnel, if you have a funnel, right? And really all sites have some funnel there, even if they're not typical conversions. It's way more complicated. And if you think you can just, make it simple and kind of go and say, well, here's my one graph that explains how performance and balance intersect, it's not that simple. And I say that as someone in our tool where we have that graph. So I get it, right? But we're exploring kind of deeper connections, and we're finding, like, if you have the referrer data, you actually might be able to make more sense of that. Well, why is it? Because if I'm driving a Facebook campaign and, people are clicking through, and, knowing that that's a segment of traffic versus, organic search, those people that are clicking through, we might expect to bounce that have nothing to do with performance, right? Because just we know that if you're driving people to campaigns, they have higher bounce rates, and that probably isn't driven by performance, right? But maybe if we understood this other, cohort or segment of our population is coming in organically, there we might find a better relationship, right, of performance to abandonment or performance to engagement. So I say that to say, like, all of that context is super helpful. And I think that's where we need as an industry to kind of add more business context and user context. RUM is a great starting point for that, into all these performance discussions.
Completely agree. Well, listen, I know you have a hard stop coming up here. We got through about half the list. I am not going to summon the summarator because I would not be able to do what Andy does.
Come on, do it.
So for everybody who was curious as to whether I was going to try to summarize, my summary is RUM is really awesome and has a lot of really cool stuff. But as with everything else, there's a lot of complications with anything performance. Once you start thinking about it, you start thinking about more and more and more, and you start getting overwhelmed pretty quickly. But the important thing is to at least have the data so that you can turn it into information. So I guess I did a little summary there. Ben, any last words before you take off?
No, it's just great. It's a lot of fun. I didn't know what to expect, and it was great to chat about topics that are, near and dear to my heart. So thanks for letting me do it.
We'll try to schedule another time. We can get Andy back on and finish up the rest of the topics. So I think they're all really cool ones still. So thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for listening. And if you have any questions, comments, tweet us at pure_DT. Ben, do you do Twitter or anything like that?
I'm so lame. I don't. Okay. I don't do social media. So
that's fine. That's fine. You're probably on Wikipedia all the time. So maybe just guessing
exactly.
from your outdated piece there. Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot. We'll talk to you soon. And thanks everyone for listening. Bye.
Thanks.